This is Bloomberg Law with June Grasso from Bloomberg Radio.
The day I take the oath of office, the migrant invasion of our country ends and the restoration of our country begins.
Donald Trump energized his supporters on the campaign trail with a litany of anti-immigrant statements and promises of securing the border and carrying out the largest mass deportations in U.S. history. His election sets the stage for a crackdown on undocumented immigrants and a rollback of measures that allow some to remain in the country legally. But his plans face legal, logistical, and financial obstacles. Joining me is an expert in immigration law, Leon Fresco, a partner at Holland Knight, and the former head of the Office of Immigration Litigation at the Department of Justice during the Obama administration. Leon, let's start with his pledge to carry out the largest mass deportations in U.S. history. Just how would he carry that out, and what would some of the obstacles be?
It's going to be a multi-stage process, and it's going to require an all-hands-on-deck governmental approach, because this is not just a matter of the Department of Homeland Security or ICE or the border. It's going to require the State Department. It's going to require the entire diplomatic corps negotiating with all of the countries in South America, in the Middle East, and in China that we're trying to actually deport people to. And so this is not going to be a very simple first step. There's the first issue, which is identifying people to deport. So how does one do that? There is some belief, and you've heard Tom Homan, who's the person now appointed to lead this operation, who was the former ICE director, say in various contexts that this isn't going to just be a grab bag where individuals are simply apprehended for no reason, but that there's going to be a targeted effort here. So the first targeted effort would obviously be criminal non-citizens. So anybody with a criminal record is going to be the number one top priority for removal. So the question is, well, when you apprehend those individuals, where do you put them? There's about 40 to 45,000 beds that are available right now for such a purpose. Obviously, if you're doing the largest deportation program in history, you're going to need a lot more beds. Where are those beds coming from? We've heard the idea that that could be in military bases, that there would be barracks for that purpose. So fine, you place people in those military barracks, you have them in detention, you put them in detention proceedings, and the question is, will there be a place to actually deport those people to when this is all said and done? Will there be countries that are willing to actually accept these individuals? So that's where, again, the State Department is going to have to play in. Secondly, are you going to need to do a whole due process deportation hearings, where these hearings are currently backed up by 7 years in the immigration court? Or will Trump be able to get away with using what's called the Alien Enemies Act, which is a law that's been around since the late 1700s, which allows deportation without due process, but you have to show that a country is specifically trying to infiltrate the United States with people designed to destabilize the United States. So will that be reviewable in a court of law? Because courts have said that things like that in the past are political questions that are not reviewable. Will they be reviewable? And if they are reviewable, will courts actually say that any country people are from is actually doing this on purpose, is actually sending criminal foreign nationals into the United States for the purpose of destabilizing the country? So all of those are questions that are going to have to be grappled with pretty early on in order to determine whether such an operation could be successful.
According to the Pew Research Center, 11 million immigrants were living illegally in the country in 2022, and more than 2 million have entered illegally since then. I mean, will it be difficult for ICE to find those who are here illegally?
Well, believe it or not, that's actually the easy part these days. With all of the artificial intelligence that ICE has procured in the last several years, and databases and documents, pretty much anyone who's left any kind of digital footprint, ICE knows where they are, either from their cell phone, their car, whether they ordered a pizza, anything of this nature. So unless you've been living in the middle of the woods as a hermit, ICE will be able to find you if it wants to find you relatively quickly. So that's sort of a 20th century concern at this point. The finding is the easy part. The question is, what do you do when you find the person? Where do you literally detain the person? And where do you actually deport the person? And that's where the Trump administration is going to have their work cut out for them.
Which countries have not agreed to receive deportation flights?
So right now, it's almost impossible to deport anyone to China, which is a big source of our removal orders. We have tens of thousands, if not over 100,000 removal orders for people who can be deported to China, but China won't accept those individuals. Cuba is another big one. Cuba, there's probably hundreds of thousands of Cubans who can be deported to Cuba, but Cuba has not and probably will not accept people given the country is almost in complete ruins, and there's another hurricane potentially coming there, and who knows? And so the country is so destabilized, accepting hundreds of thousands of people is likely not an option there. Venezuela has not accepted recently people to be deported back to Venezuela. Haiti basically has no government. They just today fired their prime minister. And the question is, what do you do vis-a-vis Haiti, and how do you deport people there? Nicaragua is another country that doesn't let people get deported back to Nicaragua from the United States. And so those are just some examples. But pretty much any country, if you're going to start doing large numbers of people, may start objecting to that and saying, look, you're going to destabilize our country, because the United States is a big country with 350 million people. But countries with 1 million people, if you suddenly put in 50,000 deportees who are all criminals, that could lead to quite the destabilization in those countries. And so they may do everything possible to try to thwart these deportations. Not to say that the Trump administration will think that that's something to be sympathetic about, but it becomes a challenge if they actually can't deport people to these countries.
First of all, Trump said on NBC, I think, that there's no price tag on this. But
Correct.
I saw estimates that put the cost at more than $300 billion.
Well, it depends what kinds of costs you're incorporating into this. So first of all, there's the normal costs that everyone would agree to include, which are the costs of detention, which include obviously care and feeding and medicine and all of that for the people while they're in custody. The cost of the actual removal itself, the planes, the many times ICE uses chartered planes to do this, all of that. But then they talk about the cost of what happens then to the economy, because interestingly, an undocumented person, when they're working in the United States, is a net positive to the U.S. federal budget, because what's happening is they're paying taxes and they're not getting any benefits because they don't qualify for any benefits. And so this is actually something that the Congressional Budget Office talks about all the time. It's only when people get status and can get benefits that they become potentially a net negative to the budget. But when you remove all these undocumented workers from the economy, you actually create a larger budget deficit hole. And so that's also being counted toward those $300 billion.
There are some immigration policies that Trump wants to put in place again. One is the Remain in Mexico policy. Explain what that is and tell us how difficult it would be to restore it.
So under the Remain in Mexico policy, the way that would work is if an individual enters the United States and asks for asylum, their asylum application is put into the system and is put in line, but where you wait is in Mexico. You don't wait in the United States. And so that was finally allowed by the Supreme Court as legal in 2019 and was about to be implemented in earnest by the Trump administration until COVID happened. And then that didn't end up happening, because what happened was instead of putting the cases in the line, the Trump administration simply just rejected people. And that actually continued into the Biden administration. And believe it or not, is happening now. So the Remain in Mexico policy will only be needed if the ban that is currently in place, which the Biden administration has in place at the moment, is overturned by the courts. Now, it is likely to be overturned by the courts. That case has sort of been slow-walked because of the election. I don't think that the people suing wanted to destabilize the border situation right before the election. But now that the election has happened, that case is back up in the forefront. And if the Biden border policy is enjoined, which is essentially a ban. Nobody can apply for asylum right now who entered illegally into the United States. If that ban is taken away by the courts and said that that ban is illegal, that's when the Trump administration will need to use remain in Mexico. And the obstacle there is that Mexico has to agree to do this. And a couple of things have happened since the last Trump administration. The Supreme Court of Mexico has said that that's not possible and it's not legal. But the question will be, what does that mean if Trump threatens Mexico with 50% tariffs on their cars unless they do this? Does the new president of Mexico, Ms. Sheinbaum, actually then say, well, we're going to have to figure something out with our Supreme Court and everything else to make this a possibility because we don't want 50% tariffs on our cars? So all of these levers are in play to try to figure out whether remain in Mexico needs to be placed back into place and can it be placed back into place.
Next, let's discuss humanitarian parole, which gives immigrants from certain countries temporary permission to live and work in the U.S. And Biden has made sweeping use of this status. How many immigrants are here, would you say, under humanitarian parole?
Well, between Ukraine and Cuba and Haiti and Nicaragua and Venezuela, we're probably talking about several 100,000 people, 200,000 to 300,000 people have been let in with these humanitarian paroles that when they expire, they will not have lawful status anymore.
So that would be pretty easy for Trump to get rid of them.
Correct. There's a couple of things there, which is that when those paroles expire, he will not renew them. And then the question is, what will those people do? Will they apply for asylum? Will some of them be eligible? But, for the Ukrainians, for instance, what does an asylum system look like? Because if the war is over, then they can go back to Ukraine. There's nobody persecuting them. If the war is not over, what is the status of those claims still? Because they're still not technically being persecuted in Ukraine. They would just be evading a war. And so it's not clear what would happen to those asylum claims. And then with regard to Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, asylum claims are possible from those countries, but will all those people apply for asylum? One would assume they would, just to slow things down. How many of those will ultimately be meritorious? Will the government place those cases in the front of the line to get them out, or will they be placed in the back of a 7 and 8 year current line? Those are all questions left to be answered.
Coming up next, I'll continue this conversation with Leon Fresco. Will immigration officials in the second Trump administration avoid some of the problems in the first? This is Bloomberg. Donald Trump has pledged to crack down swiftly on illegal immigration, including by curbing asylum, deporting millions of immigrants in the United States illegally, and even restarting construction of the wall. I've been talking to immigration law expert Leon Fresco about some of the challenges Trump will face, both legal, logistical, and financial. Leon, can Trump just say, we're not doing asylum anymore?
They can for the people crossing the border, but once you're inside the United States, you can apply for asylum, and there's nothing that the government can do to stop that. And so all of these people who have been paroled in have every right to ask for asylum, and the question will be whether those cases get prioritized so that they get moved along first, or whether they get placed in the back of the line because they want to keep the border crossing cases first, and these people have already crossed the border. And so that's going to be a very complicated challenge for the Trump administration to try to determine.
Biden has also used something called temporary protected status, which is another program that provides work permits and a deportation shield for immigrants from certain countries like Haiti.
Correct. There's also hundreds of thousands of people here on temporary protected status from over a dozen countries at this point. And here, again, when Trump was president between 2017 and 2020, he tried to cancel them all. There was lawsuits, and those lawsuits ended up getting settled during the Biden administration. They didn't end up getting resolved during the Trump administration. And so he will have to, again, try to circumvent the maelstrom of these TPS litigation and lawsuits to try to see if he can do it. But if he can do it and allow them to expire, then that's going to be another few 100,000 people that simply lose their status when that expires. That includes the famous Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, that were of such note during the election. And if all of those folks lose their status, again, they'll probably all end up applying for asylum and hoping that they can survive the 4 years of the Trump administration without their cases being heard. And that's going to be very interesting to see. Now, of course, the Trump administration may try to circumvent that with the Alien Enemies Act. But again, will a court allow them to use the Alien Enemies Act for some of these countries where it's clear that those countries probably didn't order a migration for the purposes of destabilizing the United States? Now, the Trump administration will try as hard as it can to build such a record, but their best hope will be that the courts view this as unreviewable political questions that can even be reviewed, and in which case, if that happens, even if the Trump administration was wrong about why it invoked the Alien Enemies Act, if an invocation of the Alien Enemies Act can't actually be reviewed as a political question, then it will be able to place millions of people into deportation quite quickly. Now, again, it will have to be able to execute those orders to these countries. If they decide that, fine, what we'll do is we'll just detain people in the middle of nowhere in military barracks until they get sick enough that they leave on their own. And so these are all potential options that we'll have to just wait and see how it plays out.
From what we've been talking about, Leon, it seems like it's going to be difficult for him to carry out these mass deportations.
There will be the issue of placing people in final order status. Will they be able to do that? And then there will be the question of actually moving people outside the United States, which is a separate hard question. So, yes, it's going to have to be the top priority of the State Department, the Justice Department, and the Homeland Security Department in order for that to happen. Probably it will be, there's no doubt, but it's going to require a whole of government approach that we've never seen before. And, you know, the real situation that will happen is that as these stories start to get out in the media, it starts to derail the momentum for this. Especially everyone knows their person that they know that's not one of the bad ones that needs to be deported, but that's quote-unquote one of the good ones. Why is the government going after this person? They should be going after the bad people. But it turns out most of the people won't qualify as the bad people because they'll have one or two people who say, no, that's my nanny, or that's my person who takes care of my parents, my family, etc. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Will you explain the public charge definition under Biden, what that is?
There's a law that goes all the way back to the late 1800s called the Public Charge Ground of Inadmissibility, which says that if you're trying to get legal status in America, you can be precluded from doing so by the government if the government thinks you're going to be dependent upon the taxpayers and not self-sufficient. And so there was a rule that was put in place during the prior Trump administration to really strengthen that and to say if anyone hadn't gotten basically a history of employment in their home country and a history of speaking English, they could be subject to this public charge ground. And so that had actually been allowed by the Supreme Court until it was rescinded by the Biden administration. So it should be relatively quick for them to put back this public charge ground and to really make it difficult for anybody who doesn't speak English or has any history at all of getting any kind of government benefits or is a single person that's completely unemployed and doesn't have a relative. So, for instance, they're not some sort of homemaker where there's another spouse who's making the money. Those people would be fine. But if they're just an individual who's one person without a job, all of those people would be subject now to this public charge ground that would not let them get legal status in the United States.
So during his first term, Trump's immigration actions were repeatedly stymied in court because they bypassed federal rulemaking requirements under
Correct.
the Administrative Procedures Act. Do you think that in a second term, they'll know better and they'll go by the Administrative Procedures Act?
So the second term is going to look a lot different than the first for a couple of reasons. First, the court has shrunk significantly who has standing to file these lawsuits. So a lot of times the states, for instance, when there was the travel ban was actually filed by the state of Hawaii and the state of Washington. States are going to have a lot less ability to have standing than before, although it's not fully precluded, but it's been shrunk. So that's number one. And then number two, the courts also have dramatically reduced when injunctive relief is available. So what the courts have been doing is they've been saying injunctive relief is only going to be available on a case-by-case basis, and there won't be this programmatic nationwide injunction that you can just go and get in one district court and that'll be it. You'll actually have to go through a process where a bunch of individuals get injunctive relief, and then maybe that stops the policy. And so because of that, that's all going to strengthen Trump's hands while he's doing this deportation.
What do you think of Trump making Tom Homan the border czar? He's the official behind the family separations during the first Trump administration, right?
Yeah, so I'm personally a bit conflicted because I've worked with Tom Homan when I was at the Department of Justice, and I think he's a very nice man, and him and I get along very well and have a wonderful relationship. So it's just, for me, a question of whether you agree with the policy that's going to be put in place. Because Tom Homan, the thing I can say about him is he has always been, under many different presidents, a public servant who salutes the flag. And when people have given him a lawful order, he has executed the lawful order, whether it be prosecutorial discretion or whether it be deportation. Now, while he has gone off on his own as a private citizen, he has taken a very restrictionist talking points. And so this is what he's being charged to do now, is to lead the largest deportation program in history. To be fair to him and to President Trump, they did campaign on that, so it's not a secret. Anybody who wanted that to be avoided should not have voted for President Trump. But now that President Trump has won and he campaigned on that promise, this is what Tom Homan is going to be doing. Now, the one thing I will say is, because he comes from ICE and because he has lived this for several decades, he understands the actual challenges from a legal and logistical standpoint in a way that appointing somebody who's a more political person but less of a detail-oriented person wouldn't know. And that's why I've heard Tom Homan say things like, look, we're going to have priorities. We're going to have certain people that we look at first, because at the end of the day, that's actually how you have to do this. You can't just willy-nilly round up millions of people. That's not going to be operationally possible here.
Let me ask you the big question, Leon, which you have addressed in different ways in our conversation. Will Trump be able to carry out the largest deportation of immigrants in our history?
Here is what I think. I think because people don't remember what happened in 2007. 2007 was the last time there was actually any significant, robust immigration enforcement in the middle of the streets. Even Trump, to his credit, actually, from 2017 to 2020, didn't have these sort of large-scale raids of work sites or anything like that. That didn't actually happen a lot during the Trump administration. And so the point is, when that last happened, which was in 2007 under George W. Bush, that put such fear in the immigrant community that people stopped going to work, people were hiding. It was very complicated. And so what I think they're actually trying to accomplish more than anything is like what you're seeing in all these other areas with foreign policy and with tariffs and everything else. You sort of lay down a marker that this is going to be the worst thing you've ever seen. And what you're hoping it does is it incentivizes enough people to self-deport that you're actually getting bang for the buck from that. So I think that's what you're going to see. You are going to see a more robust effort to remove people. But I think at the end of the day, if 400,000 people end up getting removed in 2025, that might be ambitious based on where the infrastructure is now. And so we're not talking about 10 million, 20 million, whatever million people we'd be talking about. But the hope is that if it's done in a way that creates enough nervousness in the community, that individuals will decide that they can't live with this level of nervousness and they would take matters into their own hands and leave the country.
A lot of moving parts, that's for sure. Thanks so much, Leon. That's Leon Fresco, a partner at Holland Knight. Donald Trump enters his second term having appointed 3 members of the Supreme Court, an achievement that led to the current conservative supermajority, which eliminated the constitutional right to abortion and slashed the power of federal agencies. Trump's campaign pledges, including tariffs, mass deportations, and environmental rollbacks, will face legal challenges. And the court, transformed by Trump, now sits as one of the few potential checks on his authority as he returns to the White House. Joining me is Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr, who's written about the possible implications. So, Greg, as you write, Trump and the court have had a complicated relationship in the past. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, this is a Supreme Court that, of course, 4 years ago refused to intervene in the 2020 election when he very much wanted them to try to overturn Joe Biden's victory. It's also a court that during his time as president gave him somewhat mixed results. You know, if you look just like in the immigration sphere, they upheld his so-called travel ban, which restricted entry into the country from certain countries, many of them predominantly Muslim. But they also ruled against him on putting a citizenship question on the census and on trying to end Barack Obama's so-called DACA program. So it's not a court that has given him the sort of knee-jerk, we side with you sort of rulings that he has suggested he wants.
Now, this surprised me. According to a database compiled by professors at Washington University in St. Louis and Penn State University, his previous administration had the lowest win rate at the Supreme Court in modern history.
Yeah, it surprises me every time I look at it. The researchers include Lee Epstein at Washington University in St. Louis, and it shows that during his 4 years, Donald Trump succeeded only 42% of the time. Those are cases where either he or his administration were a party. And just to throw out a few other numbers, Barack Obama succeeded 50% of the time. Joe Biden, so far, 54% of the time. And then you go further back, and presidents do much, much better. So it's pretty striking. And of course, not all those cases are hugely important ones or ones that we might talk about, but in terms of sort of the run-of-the-mill cases, it is a court that is not, as I said, necessarily going to knee-jerk side with Donald Trump.
Of course, there is a difference. In his first term, he didn't have this conservative supermajority that he has now.
Yes, that is an excellent point that I probably should have mentioned earlier as a qualification. So when I talked about a couple of those immigration cases, the citizenship question on the 2020 census, the case involving the so-called DACA program, which allows hundreds of thousands of young people who came into the country as children, lets them stay in the country. So when the court said Donald Trump can't block that, both of those decisions were with a 5-justice conservative majority, and with John Roberts casting the key vote, siding with the liberals in those cases. Since then, the court has shifted even further to the right. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg died and Trump replaced her with Amy Coney Barrett, we got a 6th conservative. So the dynamic has changed, and Trump will have perhaps a little bit of an easier path on some of these closely divided cases going forward.
Though you never know. So let's talk about some of the areas that could test the Supreme Court in Trump's second term. So Trump has vowed to impose a 10 to 20% tariff on all imported goods. Remind us about what happened during his first term with his steel tariffs.
So during his first term, Donald Trump imposed a 25% tariff on imported steel. Lower court said that was within his authority under something known as Section 232 of the U.S. trade laws, and that says the president has broad discretion to impose tariffs for national security reasons. And the Supreme Court let those decisions stand. It didn't question those tariffs. So, one might be inclined to say, the Supreme Court is going to defer to Donald Trump on tariffs. But now he's talking about imposing an across-the-board tariff, 10 to 20% on everything that comes into the country. And that's going to be harder to justify as a national security measure. Now, there are other provisions of the trade laws, but the bottom line is that it's not something where it's clear that the Supreme Court is going to be comfortable with the president having that much discretion, either because it reads the law as limiting his discretion or because as a constitutional matter, the court doesn't think Congress can give the president quite that much discretion to just impose on his own these sweeping tariffs.
One of the key points in his run for office was that he was going to crack down on immigration, and Trump actually promised mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. But might he face some legal problems with those mass deportations?
They sure might. The nation's immigration laws, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, says that there are certain things the executive branch can do and certain things it doesn't authorize the executive branch to do. So he's going to have to make his case under those laws. And then he also will have the Constitution that he has to deal with and the due process clause. Under established law, the president can't just pluck somebody, or the executive branch can't just pluck somebody and immediately ship them out of the country. They have a right to certain process. And so when you're talking about deporting millions and millions of people, those are going to be real legal constraints. And given the mixed record he had at the Supreme Court previously on immigration, it's fair to think that it won't be a rubber stamp at the Supreme Court. There may be some real limit on what he can do.
Now, I don't know where in his lineup of importance this is, but he's also said that he wants to end birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants. I'm not even sure, what that entails.
Yeah, and so with all these things, Donald Trump has said a lot of things, and we'll have to wait and see exactly what he tries to do. The problem is that there's a constitutional provision that has long been understood as meaning that if you're born on U.S. soil, you are an American citizen. Now, that longstanding understanding is not universal. There are folks who argue that there's a different way to interpret that provision to bar people who come in intentionally to have a baby in the country. But in any event, that one may be an especially big uphill climb if Donald Trump does pursue that.
Energy and the environment, he's expected to have almost diametrically opposed views from Biden. And what's interesting, you point this out, is that, the Supreme Court has been, for the last few years, attacking and trying to dismantle federal regulatory power. So how does that help or hurt him?
Yeah, it could come back to bite him. Let's start with that big decision known as Birthright that the Supreme Court just handed down that says that it's no longer going to defer to agencies on the meaning of ambiguous statute. That is a ruling that opponents of regulation generally like, but it's also a ruling that could come back and bite a conservative administration, a deregulatory administration, if what the Trump administration says, either through the EPA or some other agency, if it says, here's how we interpret this law, it means we're going to have less regulation than we used to. The Supreme Court, under this ruling, will say, we're actually going to be the ones that determine what that law means and what you can and cannot do. So it may mean, ironically perhaps, closer scrutiny of what the Trump administration is trying to do at its administrative agencies.
So now let's just discuss some of the cases that the court rejected today. One involving New York City's rent control system, which has been up at the court before.
It has. The court has turned away on 3 different occasions now appeals that challenge the rent control restrictions as being unconstitutional. And today, the court turned away 2 appeals, one from property owners in New York City and Yonkers, another by landlords in Westchester County. They were challenging various aspects of New York's sweeping rent control rules, including the restrictions on landlords who want to reclaim units for personal use or want to convert them to condos or co-ops. The court, as is usually the case when it denies a petition, made no comment, gave no explanation, but one justice, Neil Gorsuch, said that he would have heard the appeals. So I strongly suspect we will see future challenges, and ultimately it's possible the court will agree to take them up. This is an issue whether these restrictions unconstitutionally take private property without just compensation. It's an issue that many people feel very strongly about, and I would be surprised if we don't see more appeals challenging the system.
Now, former Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is still facing that Georgia election interference case, and he got turned down by the Supreme Court today as well.
Yes, and preface by saying the prosecution is on hold for unrelated reasons. The appeals court in Georgia is considering whether the prosecutor, Fani Willis, needs to be removed because of a romantic relationship she had with one of the prosecutors. But what the Supreme Court dealt with is Mark Meadows was trying to move the prosecution from state court into federal court. That potentially would give Meadows kind of a better jury pool if this case were to go to trial. He was invoking what's known as federal officer removal, which basically means if you're a federal officer, you might be able to say, hey, this case against me should be in federal court. And a lower court said, nah, you're no longer a government employee, and the stuff you allegedly did was not official business, so you can't use this federal officer removal power to shift to federal court. The Supreme Court today said, we're not going to take your appeal, Mark Meadows. One thing just to note, because this is a state law prosecution, this is not a case where Donald Trump, when he becomes president, can make it go away. He can't order prosecutors to drop it. It's at least possible that this case will go forward, perhaps not against Donald Trump, but against other defendants in this case. They are all accused of taking part in this scheme to overturn the 2020 election results, and Georgia prosecutors say they violated a state racketeering law.
The Supreme Court also turned down a lot of turndowns today, a case that curbs the Justice Department's ability to prosecute people and companies for bid rigging.
Bid rigging is basically what it sounds like, which is if companies that are bidding for, say, a government contract agree that one of the two of them is going to get the low bid, that can violate the antitrust laws. And the longstanding understanding, at least according to the Justice Department, was if you do that, if you agree with a competitor on what your bids are going to be, that is basically automatically an antitrust violation, and we will prosecute you criminally for that. And a federal appeals court in this case coming out of North Carolina said, no, it's not automatically an antitrust violation. You have to look at whether there were potentially pro-competitive justifications. So this is a case where the two companies also had supply arrangements. So they were bidding for these construction contracts, and one of the companies, in addition to bidding on the contract, would also supply the needed aluminum to the other company. And so what the Fourth Circuit said was, you have to look at all that stuff to figure out whether the agreements on what the bids were going to be was actually an antitrust violation. The Justice Department went to the Supreme Court and said, that's a big deal, and it's going to make it much harder for us to press these criminal price fixing, criminal bid rigging prosecutions. And the Supreme Court said, sorry, we're not going to hear your appeal. So that tougher standard for the Justice Department to meet is now, for this foreseeable future, in place in 5 mid-Atlantic states. It's something to watch because it could be an issue that crops up in other circuits, and eventually the Supreme Court may have to decide it.
Thanks so much, Greg. Always a pleasure. That's Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr.
And that's it for this edition of the Bloomberg Law Show. Remember, you can always get the latest legal news on our Bloomberg Law podcast. You can find them on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and at www.bloomberg.com/podcast/law. And remember to tune into the Bloomberg Law Show every weeknight at 10 p.m. Wall Street time. I'm June Grasso, and you're listening to Bloomberg.